Okay, so in the last class, we have discussed about different types of auto wiring, right? So also we discussed about auto wiring by name and type. So, so I assume by now you all are familiar with what is Spring and how to set up a Spring project and how to demonstrate all of this stuff, right? Okay, so any questions on this part? Okay, I'll ask few questions. So, okay, in how many ways can we do the dependency injection in Spring? And what are they? Hmm, right. So we can actually do the dependency injection. And what is the annotation that is used? Anyone? Right, at the rate AutoWide. So we can actually do the dependency injection in three ways. Either you can do it on the variable, okay, just like this, or you can have the at the rate AutoWide on a setter method, or you can even have a constructor with that. But did anyone of you gave a thought of which one is actually preferred or most suggested out of three? So the most suggested one out of the three is a constructor way of auto wiring. Okay, so this is the most preferred one because let's get rid of. So the reason is, so the if you do the auto wiring through the constructor, right, and if it failed, if if the tire bean is not available, that means the car bean cannot be created, right? So so this simply means you can only create a car bean if there is a tire bean, right? So the constructor strictly enforces that you cannot create a car object without a tire object. But if you do it this way, if you just give it on a field or on the setter, okay, so that doesn't actually guarantee anything. You can actually create a car object without a tire, and then finally the spring can set it, right? So there is nothing stopping here from creating the tire object, right? So yeah, the most preferred way is obviously having the auto wiring through the constructor. Okay. All right. Can someone tell what is the default type of auto wiring? So by default, how the auto wiring works?
It's ID,
What do you mean by ID?
class ID,
Sorry,
class ID.
class ID. Okay. Uh, so the by default, right? So I had car bean here, and I'm expecting a tire bean, and right now I only had one tire bean. Okay. So 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 this is what I had. So I have a car bean and I have a tire bean, and the auto wiring by default happens by type, right? So yeah, so the basic auto wiring happens by type. So simply it means you have a tire object and your car is expecting a tire object, right? So there might be many tire objects here, right? But if there is only one tire object and the car is expecting, it simply auto wires by type, right? So the spring simply checks, is there any bean of type tire? Okay, if there is a bean of type tire, and it will simply auto wire it. Okay, so what if you have multiple beans? So you have tire and then you have better tire. So now you have two different beans in your application context in your Spring IOC container. So you have tire as well as you have better tire, and both of them are of type tire, right? And the car is expecting a tire. So which one should the Spring auto wire here? Is there a default way that it can go about? Right? So there are two options available here. So the Spring will be confused, right? So then you can give the name for each of the bean and then you can auto wire it. So that's what auto wiring by name actually means. So in that scenario, you actually have to give a name for each of the bean, each of the class, right? So the better tire should have a name, and then this tire should have a name. And finally, when you auto wire, you can simply tell, okay, I want a bean whose name is whatever this is, right? So auto wire tire. So now if you do this, the auto wiring happens by name. Okay, so that means this, the name of this bean is off-road bean, and the car is telling that I need off-road bean, and now this bean will be injected, right? So that's what auto wiring by name actually. Okay, so that's all about Spring dependency injection, inversion of controller, a container in the Spring, which is also can be called as bean factory or application context. Okay, all right. So to just summarize, to make an application a Spring application, you need a dependency for it, right? And the second thing is you need a configuration file for it, right? So you need to tell how the application context has to be created, right? So you'll tell, do the component scan, right? So component scanning is a very important feature of Spring, right? So component scanning simply means that it goes to one of the package, whatever the base package that you specify, and it starts looking at the components. It starts looking at the classes and finds which are annotated with the @ component, right? So what happens if something is not annotated with the @ component in the component scan? Anyone? So if you look at this hello world class, it's not annotated with the @ component. So how does the Spring react when it does the component scan from org.example?
So the hello world will not be a bin. So it will they ignore it.
Exactly. It will simply ignore that bean, right? So the Spring will not manage it. It will simply ignore it. It's almost like it doesn't know anything about hello world. Okay, so that's what a component scan means. Component scan simply means it start looking at all the classes at the package specified, and based on that it will create the application context. And the second important thing is annotations, right? So annotations are everything. So Spring, either you can go with XML based configuration, but for this tutorial we are not going with the XML configuration, right? So that's the old way of doing, and now everyone are actually depending on the annotation configurations, right? So the second thing is, third thing is annotating your classes, right? So @ component, @ void, @ qualifier, and all that to register your beans in the application context, or to specify the auto wiring and all that stuff. And finally, and the last thing is ultimately creating the application context. So this is the Spring IOC container. right? And this can also be called as the bean factory or whatever, right? And it can also be called as application context, right? So looking at this beans.xml under your resources folder, it simply creates an application context, something like this, right? And then anywhere in your application, you can start asking for these beans, right? And that simply creates the beans. So that's all about Spring. Okay. All right. So shall we move forward to learn about the Spring Boot? Any questions on the Spring? All right, I'll take that as a no. So let's get started. So the next thing that we discuss is something called Spring Boot. Okay. So let's see what is a Spring Boot. So we can, if you want to learn anything, we can simply go to the Spring projects. Okay. And you can look, one of the project that Spring guys provided is Spring Boot. Okay. So they initially came up with Spring framework in 2004, but later they came up with many projects like Spring Data, Spring Cloud, Spring Security, and all of that. But very recently, like probably 8 years back or sometime, they came up with something called Spring Boot. Okay. So we can learn each of these Spring projects, and then we can finally go to the Spring Boot, or we can learn Spring Boot, and then we can build the projects in a Spring Boot way. Okay, so that's the approach we are taking. So we learn what is Spring Boot, and then from now on, every application that we'll be building is a Spring Boot application, and in that Spring Boot application, we'll be using all the other Spring projects. Okay, so let's see what is Spring Boot. So the basic definition they gave you is takes an opinionated view of building Spring applications and gets you up and running as quickly as possible. Okay. So what happened after the Spring guys introduced the Spring framework in 2004? Okay. So 2004 is where you got Spring applications, right? So you know what it takes to build a Spring applications. You need a configuration files, you need annotations and all that stuff. So later they have Spring Data, which is almost like Hibernate, right? So if you look at the Hibernate project is also very similar, right? So first you need to have the dependencies, required dependencies, and then you need to maintain a configuration XML file telling everything about the database, right? And then finally, you have to have your annotations, right? So you need to annotate whatever you want at the rate IDs. And then finally, you will create a session factory and start talking to the database, right? So, so later the Spring guys came up with similarly many applications like projects like Spring Security and all that stuff. Okay. So one problem that we had is many times a project needs multiple of them. A project needs Spring, it needs Spring Data, as well as Spring Security and so on, right? So in one of the enterprise project, you'll end up using all of these. And the problem with these is you will end up having a lot of configuration XML files, right? So it gets really tough for you to maintain these configuration files. So the Spring guys thought, okay, so that's what they call as opinionated view. So the thought, can't we simplify this project building? Can't we make it simple? They started thinking, do we actually need all these XML configuration? Is there a way to get rid of this configuration? Or is there a way to simply create the application context without asking? Okay, is there a way to simply do the component scan without the developer specifying, right? So they started giving a thought for this, and at some point, building a Spring application uh, resulted. It's a lot difficulty to maintain because they ended up having too many XML files and too many configurations going in the application. So they came up with something called Spring Boot. Okay, so it simply means it's the way in which you can bootstrap developing a Spring application. Okay, so bootstrap simply means speeding up. Okay, so Spring Boot application is a way you can speed up Spring application development. Okay, Spring Boot is not for Python application development, or Spring Boot is not for JavaScript um, development. Okay, so Spring Boot is specifically for speeding up the Spring application development. Okay, so after 2004, the Spring guys are really popular. Spring community is so popular. They had many projects, right? Whatever you see over here, they ended up with a lot of projects, and and the Java community, they started adapting to these projects. So they started using these projects, and that resulted in a lot of configuration files and all that stuff. So the Spring guys thought they should simplify this, and they came up with Spring Boot. Okay, so you know what is a Spring? Basically, if you consider all the Spring projects, it's a huge framework, right? It's a huge framework using which you can build uh, enterprise applications, right? So without knowing, you might be using Spring if you're using uh, whether banking applications, or if you're using any e-commerce applications, uh, anything like that, right? So Spring is used, it's a huge framework, and it's used in a lot of enterprise Java applications, right? And the thing is, many times it's not just one Spring project, right? So they use Spring Context for dependency injection, they use Spring Web for the REST APIs. Okay, they use Spring Batch for batch applications. Okay, and all that stuff. So now they came up with Spring Boot that makes it easy to develop this kind of Spring application, which even has a lot of Spring projects in it. Okay, so let's quickly see what are the problems that we have with the Spring and how the Spring Boot gets rid of it. Okay, the first problem that we discussed is multiple configurations, right? So if you're building a project that needs dependency injection and also that needs Hibernate, so the project will have beans.xml, also it should have Hibernate config XML, right? And if you're using Spring Security, Spring Web and all that, you will be ended up with some tens of XML files. So one drawback with the Spring application is multiple configurations. So you end up with having a lot of XML files. And the second thing is multiple setups, right? So you need one single setup for building the application context, right? And you need other setup for building your session factory, right? So similarly, there are many things going at the same time, right? So for the Spring Web, there is a different thing. For Spring Security, there is a different thing, right? So everything has to be maintained separately, right? So you need multiple setups, and ultimately it's a huge framework maintaining all those together. So it's a problem. So the other problem is, so you decided that you want dependency injection, right? So what dependency do you use? So you're building a new application and it needs dependency injection. So what is the dependency that you'll add in the pom.xml? Anyone? Do you know what dependency you'll use in pom.xml if you want to use Spring dependency injection feature. You can refer and tell. So you don't know what is right. So you'll use the Spring context, right? So Spring context, you'll use the Spring context dependency. Okay. And if you see, the one that we used is version 6.0.11. Okay. So we used version 6.0.11. And okay, so you wanted Spring dependency injection, you got Spring context. So you decided that you want Spring data, which is similar to Hibernate. So you will get Spring data and you will get some version, maybe 5.3. And you might need Spring Web, which we'll learn in the next week, to build the REST APIs. And you get a version called maybe 4.2. Okay. The problem here is one version of Spring data might not work well with the other version of Spring context, right? And one version of Spring Web might not work well with a version of Spring data, right? So this, you will have these version problems with the Spring. So whenever you're using a lot of Spring projects in your application, this is one of the common problem. So one problem is you have to figure out what version of Spring context works well with what version of Spring data and what version of Spring Web. So you'll have this all that trouble with the regular Spring applications, right? So any questions till now? Any questions about the drawbacks that we discussed with the Spring? Okay, so these are the problems: multiple setups, multiple configuration files, and the version things and all that. Okay, and the Spring guys, they thought, can we abstract these steps? So they thought, okay, so do we actually need a beans.xml, right? So do we actually need a beans.xml? Ultimately, we are doing component scan from the base package, right? So why can't we simply do the component scan automatically, right? Or they thought, why do we need a XML file for this thing, right? So why do we need XML stuff in the Java? Why can't we simply maintain these properties betterly? And why do we need this mapping, right? So can't we just go by the annotations, right? So if you look at your customer order, we already annotated with @entity, but you still have to tell @mapping, right? So those are the things that the Spring community started thinking about. What they felt that a lot of these steps are redundant, because, right? So let's just take the example of dependency injection. Okay, so if 1,000 people adapted to this dependency injection and everyone started using, okay, so maybe Amazon started using Spring dependency injection, or Bank of America started using Spring dependency injection. So like that, thousands of applications, Spring applications are built. Okay, and if you look at all these 1,000 applications, everything are built in the same way. They have a beans.xml and they are creating the application context on their own, right? So the Spring guy thought, okay, we should automate this. Why do they have to maintain all these configurations and all that stuff? Why can't we simply automate this stuff? Okay, so that's one thing with the regular Spring, right? So that's why it is called an opinionated framework. Okay, so it is referred as opinionated framework because it's the opinion that they have. So they thought this is how the Spring applications are built. Okay, so this is how a regular Spring application is built. Okay, so and based on that opinion, they built a framework to get rid of that. And if someone wants to do it differently, they still can do it. Okay. 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 And if you look at the problems with other things, so we'll discuss the other benefits that we have with the Spring Boot when we discuss about Spring Data and the Spring Web. Okay. So the next week we'll learn about Spring Data even better, and you learn an important skill set called REST APIs. Okay. So you learn Spring Web. So when we discuss those, we'll actually go through what benefits that Spring Boot that do using Spring Web through Spring Boot had over simply using a Spring Web application. Okay, so okay, so that's it. So it makes the Spring application development easier for you. Okay, so let's see. The next thing that we should discuss is how can we actually create a Spring Boot application. Okay, so how did we create a Spring application? So I had a regular application, regular Maven application. How did I make this as a Spring application? If we have a regular Maven application, how can we make this a Spring application? Anyone?
You providing the artifact ID and the group ID and the form.xml file.
Right. So if you simply add the Spring dependency, that will simply get the Spring related jars into your application. And now this is not just a Maven application. This is also a Spring application. So similarly, Spring Boot is also similar. It's a Maven application. So you can use Maven and you can simply add some dependencies that makes it a Spring Boot application. Okay. Before that, let's see how we can actually create a Spring application. Okay. So simply go to type start.spring.io. Okay. So you can go to this website, so called as Spring Initializer. Okay, and here you can basically generate a basic Spring Boot application for you. Okay, so you'll get so you can choose the options and it gives you a basic Spring Boot application and you can start using that. Okay, what kind of project do you want? Do you want a Gradle project or a Maven project? So Gradle is also similar to Maven. Okay, so Maven we use for build, we use for dependency management, we use for project structure and all that stuff. So similar to Maven, there is a different tool also called as Gradle. Okay, so since we learned Maven, let's go with Maven. And Spring Boot works not just with Java, but it also works with Groovy and Kotlin, which are built on top of Java. Okay, so I'll just go with Java and then we can go with any default Spring Boot version. So Spring Boot will also have versions. So you can give a group ID com.example and then maybe choose it as Java training Spring Boot test. Okay. So something like this. And then, so how do you want to package the application, right? So running a Maven package, what do you want ultimately out of Maven package? Do you want a jar out of it or a var out of it, right? So for just the regular Java projects, we'll be generating a jar out of it. Okay, so I'll just go with Java jar and Java version. Okay, I'm good with the 17. And dependencies, if you want to add any dependencies in the pom.xml, you can right away add it here. Okay, and I'll simply click on generate, and that downloads us a okay. So let's go to the downloads, and that gave me a Java Spring Boot application. So I'll simply extract this here. So I extracted it, and we can just open it and see how it actually looks. Okay, so let's go to our IntelliJ open, go to the downloads. Okay, and here it's Java training June, and then inside you'll have another folder. So we're just opening the Spring Boot application that we have generated by using the Spring initializer here. Okay, so let's look how the project structure actually looks. Let the Maven be done with its job. Okay, so now I think, so what is the first thing you would see? So if you're given an application, what is the first thing you would see?
Pom.xml.
Right? So looking at the pom.xml, you will get to know a lot of information. Okay, so you can start looking at it, right? So you have com.example, which is the group ID, you have artifact ID, and you, it by default, it gave few dependencies. Okay, one is Spring Boot starter. Okay, and the other is Spring Boot starter test. Okay, and we have some plugins. And also, if you look at it, this is the important stuff with the Spring Boot. Okay, so you'll not see the parent tag in the regular Spring applications, but you'll see the parent tag when it comes to Spring Boot application. Okay, so that actually means this application is like a child application to Spring Boot starter parent. Okay, so if you look at the external libraries, you will see a lot of jars, right? So if you remember, do you remember the Spring context?
Mm.
Right? So Spring context is the one that we used for our regular Spring application. Okay, so you got that just by creating a Spring Boot. So they thought that, okay, if someone is creating a Spring Boot, they would definitely want the Spring context, right? So you got the Spring context, and you got the Spring Boot starter things. You got Spring Boot starter test, and also, yeah, you got something related to the unit tests and all that stuff. Okay, so these are all the dependencies that you got just by creating a Spring Boot application. Okay, let's see how the project structure looks. We have Java folder, we have resources folder. So we have a class that has a main method, and we have a dot properties file. Okay, so this is how a basic Spring Boot application actually looks. Okay, so this is how you create a Spring Boot application. Any questions on this?
So we can make the project from the IntelliJ, right?
Exactly, yeah. So I just showed you the Spring initializer so you would know it, but it doesn't mean you always have to go through the Spring initializer. You can simply go to new here, project. Okay, and you even have the Spring initializer here. So it's the same thing that we used over the web, but the IntelliJ guys integrated it here well, right? So you have the Spring initializer here as well. So you can give a name to the project, You can choose the same things that you choose over the language, what type of application, and what is the packaging, Java thing, and all that stuff. Okay, you can
What is
even
war?
create the Spring Boot application from here. Yes.
Okay, so what is war?
Sorry, war. Okay, so war. So jar is like Jupyter version of Java project, right? War is when you have both the HTML code as well as Java code in one application, right? So sometimes you'll have application which contains both the front end and back end code, like the HTML, JavaScript, and also the Java code in the same thing. In those scenarios, you package the application as a war and not ZAR. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So yeah, you can create a project from IDE, or you can create from start.spring.io, or you can even turn a regular Maven project into a Spring Boot project, right? If you compare it with the regular project, the differences that you would see is, the main difference that you would see is this parent tag. Okay, so you can modify your pom.xml to actually make it a Spring Boot application, right? So that's the other way you can basically create a Spring Boot application. Okay, is that clear for everyone? Okay, so that's how we create a Spring Boot application. Now let's see what the Spring Boot application is capable of. Okay, so we look at the earlier two projects. One is the Spring Dependency project, and the other thing is Hibernate project. And we'll see how we can easily do both of these in the Spring Boot application in a while. Okay. All right. So now we saw that external libraries, without adding any dependencies, we got the Spring context with the Spring Boot. Okay. So if you see, you already got the Spring context. So now you have the application context benefits. So you can start using it, right? So I'll simply copy paste whatever the classes I have earlier. Okay, so I'll copy paste the tire. So I have a tire class here. I'll also copy paste the car. I just want to demonstrate how the application, how this goes. I mean, how the dependency injection goes in the Spring Boot. Okay, so I have a tire, I have a car, and I annotated with the right things, right? And like said, one benefit of the Spring Boot is you don't have to come up with the XML configurations. So I'm not adding the beans.xml that we have here, but I'm simply annotating the classes here. Okay, so we can even add the hello world. Okay, and we can annotate this with the component. Okay, so we got the Spring context by default with the Spring Boot, and Spring Boot, you don't need the XML configurations, right? And so let's see what's the first benefit of the Spring Boot. So the first benefit of the Spring Boot is it performs the component scan. Okay, so if you look at this main method, okay, so this is where the Spring Boot application starts running. Okay, this is where you can start running the application. Okay, so when you start running this application, so a lot of things happen. So one of that is component scan. Okay, so if you look at this class, this is an important class in the whole Spring Boot application, a class that is annotated with Spring Boot application. Okay, so this class does a lot of things, and one of them is component scan. Okay, do you remember the component scan earlier we are talking? So a component scan happens from the package that you specified. But in the Spring Boot, you don't have to worry about it. It does the automatic component scan from the package in which this class is present. So this class is present in com.example.this. So it does the component scan by default from this package. Okay, so you don't have to worry about the component scan thing. So it will do automatically. And so that's the first benefit that you get out of the Spring. And the second benefit is you don't have to worry about creating the application context, right? So in a regular Spring application, if you look at it, you see you have to create the application context out of an XML file. But with the Spring Boot, you don't have to create application context. The Spring will automatically create the application context for you, and you can simply ask for it anywhere in the application. You can simply say private application context, and you can simply say, okay, Spring Boot, I guess you have already created application context, simply auto wire that here. Okay, so now I can start using, but I cannot use in the main method. The main method has to completely execute. So I'll have a run method by implementing a command line runner. Okay, so don't worry about it. This run method is something that will be executed after the main method. So we want the main to be completely executed because that's where all the stuff goes. Okay, so in the run, now I can start using the application context that is auto-wide above. So I can say context dot get bean, and I can say hello world dot class. So this gives me a hello world bean. And now, as per the tradition, let's start with the hello world. Okay. So the application started running, and you can finally see the hello world, right? So does that guarantee that so you got a hello world object here? What if you don't get a hello world object here? What do you think the output is? What do you think the output is if the application context doesn't give you a hello world object?
Null point exception.
Exactly, you would get a null pointer exception. Okay, similarly, you can ask for a car object. Okay, and you can simply call it. Right, so you can see that working. So the thing that you should recognize is there are a lot of things that Spring Boot is doing under the hood, right? So the first benefit is you simply got rid of beans.xml, right? So you don't need a beans.xml. And the second thing is uh, you don't have to create the application context. You don't have to tell about the component scan, anything, right? The Spring Boot automatically does the component scan from the package in which this class is present, and it created the components on its own. So it went through one class after the other. It found the @ components, and then it created. And same thing, if you don't annotate with the @ component, right? So what do you think will happen? Right? So it failed to start because you are actually asking for, you're actually asking for a hello world bean, which the Spring is not aware of. Okay. A component of bean hello world that could not be found, right? So we are asking for the hello world bean, but Spring doesn't know because we haven't annotated with the @component. Okay, so that's how the component scan does. That's how an application context is created, and so you can start using the dependency injection. So that's the first benefit. So that's how you can easily do the dependency injection in the Spring Boot. Okay, any questions on this? I can wait for a while if you want to like go over this again.
So why we can't have those code in the main method?
So yeah, so let's get rid of the run. So that's a good question. Why, you might think, why do we actually need a run method? Okay, so main method is where the application starts running. Okay, and okay, so if you actually see, this is a static method, right? So main method is a static method. So the application context that is auto void is not a static thing. Okay, so let's try to make it as a static and let's run. Okay, so it says bean application context is null. Okay, so that's what. So we should actually let the main method execute. So it, by the time you ask for the context, right? By the time you need the context, it has to execute this part. So this is an important part that has to be executed. Okay, so for that reason, anything that you want to do in the Spring, so you have to do after this main method is successfully executed. Okay, so if you go inside this, it will do a lot of things. It will do component scans, it will create the application context and all that stuff. Okay, so yeah, for that reason, we have to simply let the main execute and do anything that you want to do in the run method. So run method, the way you can see is it is simply executed after the main. So that's how you should see it. Okay, any other questions?
So the run is come from the Spring Boot or it's from the JVM?
So it's a command line runner. So it's one of the functional interface that is added by the Spring Boot guys. Okay, so yeah, it's just it's a functional interface that is added. Okay, so any other questions? Okay, so the next thing, let's see how we can do the Hibernate thing easily in our Spring Boot. Okay, so first thing, should we tell the Spring Boot where the database is present, or will it find on its own?
I think we should tell them.
Right? Yeah, we have to tell that it's not it cannot do any magic, but just reduces the work. So we have to tell where the database is present. So you have to, any such properties will go into this file. Okay, you can give the URL, you can give the data source driver. Okay, and then Spring, you can give the username, you can give the password, and what are the other things that we have over here? So we have driver class, username, password. We need the DDL auto, show SQL, and the dialect. Okay. So the other thing is there might be coming from JPA. Okay, so JPA Hibernate DDL auto, and then shows. Okay, so we want to see the SQL, so true, and the DDL auto we want to create every time. So we are still in the testing phase, and the password is ABCD1234, and the username is, I guess it's root. Okay, and the driver thing, it is com dot this thing. Okay, and the URL is okay. So let's connect to the database and see what we have. So I have a university database that I can use. Okay, and I'll simply get rid of the classes that we have here. Okay, and I'll say not e-commerce, but I want to connect to university database. Okay, okay, so we want to use Spring Data here. So Spring Data is the one that takes care of talking to the database. Okay, Spring Data. So it's a regular Spring Boot project, but we haven't added any Spring Data dependency. So you can simply go over here and you can add a dependency. Okay, that is Spring Boot starter data JP. Okay, so the data related dependency is Spring Boot starter data JPA. Okay, so we're going to learn Spring data JPA. So let's refresh it. So you get all the dependencies related to this. We should see Spring Boot starter data JPA. So other thing that you should see is we haven't specified any versions here, right? So you don't have to specify the version in the Spring Boot because it knows what versions of Spring Data JPA works well with what versions of Spring context, right? So you don't have to worry about the versions. The Spring Boot will take care of getting the right versions for you. Okay, so that's the other benefit with the Spring. Okay, so now we have the Spring Data. So we can now have some. So I'll simply copy paste. Okay, no, I'll just create a class called student. Okay. I'll have int enrollment ID, Spring first name, Spring last name, Spring. Okay, so Spring Data JPA is built on top of Hibernate. Okay, so whatever you learned in the Hibernate is still very much valuable. So tell me, what annotation should we use to convert a class into a table? Anyone? Do you remember what annotation did we use in the Hibernate? Right, @entity, right? So the first thing is @entity. So what else? What annotation should we use? What else? Sorry?
column.
@column. Yeah, we can definitely use column, but a table needs a primary key, so we need @ID, right? So this is the basic thing. So that's all needed in the Spring Data. Okay, so if you compare with the Hibernate, the first thing that you had is you had the dependencies in the pom.xml, right? And the second thing you had is you had the configuration file, right? So we specified the configuration related stuff in the Spring Boot at a common configuration file. So application.properties is the common file where you will have all the configuration related stuff. Okay. So, and annotations, right? So you can't ignore. So, but these things, the mapping things, you don't have to do it, right? So anything under, when it does the component scan, it finds the classes. So, and annotations, we gave the right annotation. So let's run and see what happens. So it cannot load the driver class. Okay, so what am I missing here? It says it cannot load the driver class. Any idea? Any idea why it cannot find load the driver class? No one? Right. So the dependency, the driver class doesn't come with the Spring Data API, right? So the driver class responsibility is from the MySQL guys. So the Spring guys, they cannot maintain the driver class of the MySQL guys. So we still need to have the driver class. So I'll simply copy paste this stuff. And I'll paste that in here and reload. So that should get you the driver class added in here somewhere. Okay, it should be somewhere here. Okay, it should dot MySQL. Is it MySQL? Okay, here it is. So this is the thing that we needed. Okay, now we have it. So let's run this again. So if you see, you can still see the dependency injection working. Along with that, you can see some Hibernate related annotations, right? So if you go to your database and let's refresh it. So you see a student table created with the enrollment ID, address, first name. So what happened? So now in the Spring Boot, we have multiple projects. We are using the Spring functionality. We are also using the Hibernate functionality. Like we are using Spring Data API, which is built on top of the Hibernate. So you should acknowledge how simple it is to do the project using the Spring Boot, right? So you don't need to maintain an XML configuration file, right? And you don't have to tell a lot of things about it. You just have to tell what database it has to connect, right? And the other thing is you don't have to actually write all this stuff about the session factory, getting the configuration, beginning the transaction, and all that stuff. Okay. So whenever a session factory is created, just like the tables are created, so during the component scan, okay, so it looks at, okay, so there is a Spring Data JPA dependency. Okay, so there is something called Spring Data JPA mentioned. So this application is trying to talk to the database, right? So it knows if the way it works is if it sees a Spring Data JPA dependency, it will start looking for the database data source connection things, and it establishes the connections, and based on the component scan, it even creates the database tables. Okay, so you can see so bootstrapping Spring Data JPA repositories, right? So it found the database related stuff. So it started creating the Hibernate related stuff, right? So you can see the tables created. All right, so that's how we do the earlier projects that we did in a Spring Boot. Okay, so over the next whole week, we'll learn two important things. So one is we learn in detail about the Spring Data JPA. Okay, and we'll also learn in detail about REST APIs, right? This is one serious important skill that every Java developer should know. Okay, so the next week, we'll use the Spring Boot, and in the Spring Boot, we'll learn about Spring Data JPA, Spring Web, and the Spring MVC. And the later week, we'll take a use case and we'll start working on the project. And a week after that, you will have the evaluation. Okay, all right, I'll stop the recording here.